More than 70 members of his own party want him gone. His closest aides have walked out. Half the country, according to a major poll, agrees with them. And yet, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom stood at a podium on Monday and said, no, he's not leaving. That decision, made inside Downing Street as his party disintegrates around him, may define whether Britain enters its third leadership crisis in 4 years, or whether one stubborn man manages to hold an empire of chaos together with his bare hands. This is London, Monday, the 11th of May, 2026. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer was battling to save his position, refusing to step aside despite mounting pressure from within his own party and a wave of resignations among close aides. Resignation calls intensified after more than 70 Labour MPs publicly urged the Labour leader to quit, while several parliamentary aides stepped down in protest. This is not a fringe revolt. This is not a handful of backbenchers nursing old grudges. This is the parliamentary spine of the governing party, people elected under Starmer's banner who knocked doors for him, who stood beside him, now publicly telling him his time is up. The immediate trigger was the crushing defeats in local election results on May 8th, which saw Labour lose hundreds of council seats across England, surrender long-held ground in Wales, and fall behind rivals in Scotland. 3 days after that electoral collapse, the United Kingdom is staring at a leadership crisis with no clear end in sight. If you want fast, fact-based coverage on breaking political stories as they move, subscribe now, because this one is accelerating by the hour. Let's go back to May 8th, local election day across the United Kingdom. Councils up for grabs, hundreds of seats. The kind of midterm test that any government knows will sting, but which no government expects to be catastrophic. Labour was braced for losses. What it was not braced for was a full-scale rout. Labour lost hundreds of council seats across England, surrendered long-held ground in Wales, and fell behind rivals in Scotland. To understand what that means, you have to understand British political geography. Some of those English council seats hadn't been Conservative or Reform for decades. Some of those Welsh communities had voted Labour through Thatcher, through Blair, through austerity. They didn't just swing away from Labour. They moved to Nigel Farage's Reform UK, a party that, barely 2 years ago, didn't hold a single seat in Parliament. In Scotland, Labour's difficulties were laid bare as John Swinney secured a decisive victory, dealing a further blow to Starmer's authority. Scotland was supposed to be where Starmer's Labour was making a comeback. That comeback didn't come. And here is where the story gets more complicated. Because the aftermath of those results didn't produce quiet reflection inside Labour. It produced open war. By the weekend, the tally of Labour MPs demanding Starmer's resignation had passed 70. Then aides started resigning. Not leaking. Not briefing against him anonymously. Resigning. Publicly. Sam Carlin, one of the MPs calling for change, said Starmer was not the right person to revive the struggling party, joining Labour colleagues from across the United Kingdom in urging the Prime Minister to step down for the sake of the movement and the people they serve. That is an elected member of Parliament from the governing party telling the sitting Prime Minister, on the record, to leave. Former Minister Catherine West led efforts to formalize the challenge, calling for a timetable to elect a new leader as early as September. September. That's the target some rebels are working toward. A new Labour leader installed by autumn. A new political direction. A new face. On a government that has barely had time to unpack its boxes in Downing Street. And Starmer's response? Starmer struck a defiant tone in what has been termed a reset speech on Monday, insisting he would not resign. I take responsibility for not walking away, not plunging our country into chaos as the Tories did, he said. That line is pointed. It's a reference to the revolving door of Conservative Prime Ministers Britain endured. Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, each collapsing faster than the last. Starmer is essentially arguing, I am the stability. I am the alternative to that chaos. His critics inside Labour would say, you're already the chaos. The question is, which version of this story does the British public believe? A recent YouGov poll found that around half of Britons believe Starmer should step down. Half the country. Including, it appears, the majority of his own party's elected representatives. Here's the part that keeps getting buried in the headlines. This isn't just about election results. There are 3 separate crises converging on one man at exactly the same time, and any one of them alone could end a prime ministership. To understand why this rebellion has reached the point of no return, you have to look at what's been piling up around Starmer's leadership, not just last week, but over months. First, the economy. Rising UK borrowing costs have added to concerns about the government's economic and public service policies and the failure to ease living costs. That matters because Labour's central promise, the reason millions of people voted them into Downing Street, was economic relief, a fairer deal. The cost of living crisis that crushed households during the Conservative years was supposed to improve. Instead, borrowing costs are climbing. The pressure on families hasn't eased, and people are noticing. Second, the diplomatic embarrassment. Starmer was also hurt by his decision to appoint Peter Mandelson, a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, as Britain's ambassador to Washington. Let that land. The man Starmer chose to represent the United Kingdom to the most powerful government on earth, his hand-picked ambassador to Washington, is now under a criminal investigation launched by London police, according to other reports. The optics of that appointment have proven deeply damaging, and there's no clean way to walk it back. Third, the transatlantic relationship. Trump and Starmer's relationship had become strained, with the president saying, "This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with," blasting the UK leader's reluctance to let US warplanes use its bases after the start of the war against Iran. That is a public humiliation at the highest level of global politics. The President of the United States comparing the sitting British Prime Minister unfavorably to a World War II leader, and doing it openly. The special relationship between the US and UK, historically the cornerstone of British foreign policy, is visibly fraying. Do you think Starmer can survive all 3 of these crises simultaneously, or is the pressure now simply too great? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is a story where public opinion matters enormously. Now here is where the politics becomes genuinely fascinating. Under Labour rules, a leadership contest can be triggered if sufficient backing coalesces behind a challenger, typically through nominations from MPs and affiliated groups. If Starmer were to resign, the party would move into a formal contest period, culminating in a vote among members. That process takes time, weeks, possibly months. And during that entire period, while Britain is navigating a strained relationship with Washington, a war in the Middle East affecting UK strategic interests, and an economy under pressure, the government would be functionally leaderless, running on autopilot. That is what Starmer is pointing at when he warns against chaos. And that is exactly the dilemma his opponents inside Labour haven't fully answered. Here is what most coverage is missing. The 3 people most likely to replace Starmer all have serious problems of their own. Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham would need to return to Parliament to mount a bid, while Angela Rayner continues to contend with the fallout from past tax issues. Health Secretary Wes Streeting is viewed as a more immediate contender. Think about that for a moment. The party demanding a new leader hasn't agreed on who that leader would be. The frontrunner most immediately available, Wes Streeting, is a health secretary still managing a national health service in crisis. Angela Rayner carries unresolved political baggage. Andy Burnham isn't even in Parliament. Labour is not fighting to replace a failing leader with a ready successor. They're fighting to replace a failing leader with a question mark. Step back from Westminster for a moment. Step back from the speeches, the poll numbers, the resignation letters, and the political calculations. Think about what ordinary people in Britain are actually experiencing right now. You voted in July 2024. You voted Labour, maybe for the first time. Maybe your parents voted Labour their whole lives, and so did you. You voted because you wanted change. Real, felt economic change. Lower bills. A functioning NHS. A sense that someone in charge actually understood the pressure you were under. Less than 2 years later, your party is at war with itself. Your Prime Minister is under siege from his own side. The ambassador your government chose to represent Britain in Washington is under criminal investigation. Your local council, Labour for decades, just flipped to a party that barely existed a few years ago. And now there are whispers about a leadership contest that could last months, during which nothing gets done, no legislation moves, no policy gets implemented, because the people running the country are too busy fighting each other to run the country. That is the lived political reality for millions of Britons right now. Not an abstraction, not a Westminster bubble story, a real, grinding uncertainty about whether the government they elected is capable of governing. And here's the dimension that doesn't get enough attention. The result in Scotland drew attention from President Donald Trump, who publicly congratulated Swinney and appeared to take a swipe at Starmer. When a foreign head of state publicly congratulates the man who defeated your prime minister's party in your own country, and simultaneously mocks your prime minister for lacking the spine of a wartime leader, that reverberates. It reverberates in boardrooms, in trade negotiations, in the corridors of NATO, in Brussels. Britain's credibility as a stable, decisive partner isn't just a domestic political concern. It's a diplomatic asset, and right now, it is depreciating. For Labour voters who live outside London, the former industrial towns, the Welsh valleys, the Scottish constituencies that Labour once owned like inheritance, this collapse feels more personal than political. These are communities that gave Labour their loyalty for generations, and are now watching that loyalty returned with a wave of internal chaos and an ambassador scandal. The Farage factor complicates everything further. Reform UK's surge in the local elections wasn't just a protest vote, it was a realignment. Voters who went from Conservative to Labour in 2024, looking for something different, have now moved again, rightward, to a party built on disruption. That's not a swing Labour can easily reverse. That's a structural shift that whoever leads Labour next will have to address from a standing start. And none of that changes if Starmer goes. In fact, in the short term, a leadership contest makes Labour's position among those voters worse, not better, because it confirms the image of a party too absorbed in internal politics to focus on the people it claims to represent. Monday is not the end of this. It may not even be the middle. The rebels inside Labour have set an informal deadline. There are reports of backbenchers putting pressure on the cabinet, the senior ministers, to move. If cabinet members begin withdrawing support publicly, Starmer's position becomes untenable almost overnight. That's how it worked with Boris Johnson in 2022. Not the public rebellion alone, but the moment the cabinet began to fracture. Watch the cabinet. Watch especially Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, and the Chancellor, because if any of them begin to publicly distance themselves, the arithmetic changes completely. And watch the international dimension. Britain's relationship with Washington is under strain. The UK's position inside the European-American security framework, complicated by Brexit, now further complicated by the Iran conflict and the question of military base access, needs a prime minister with credibility. A leader consumed by internal revolt cannot project that credibility. The question for Britain's allies isn't just who leads Labour, it's who leads Britain, and for how long. Let's zoom out. What is actually happening in British politics, not just this week, but structurally? Labour won the 2024 general election with a landslide in seats, but a historically modest share of the vote. The Conservatives had collapsed. Reform split the right. Labour walked through a door that had been broken down by someone else's failure, rather than one they had to force open themselves. That matters now, because when you win power without winning conviction, you govern on borrowed legitimacy. And borrowed legitimacy has a repayment date. The May 8th local elections were that date arriving. What Nigel Farage's Reform UK demonstrated, again, is that the British electorate is not done reshaping itself. The old two-party certainties are gone. Voters in England, Wales, and Scotland are fluid in ways that neither Labour nor the Conservatives fully understand. And Reform has positioned itself as the repository of that frustration. Anti-establishment, loud, and disciplined enough to actually win seats. For Keir Starmer personally, the question is no longer whether he has a long-term future. The question is whether he has a short-term one. His reset speech on Monday bought him time. Whether it bought him days, weeks, or months, nobody inside Westminster claims to know. Three figures are seen as frontrunners to succeed Starmer: Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham, Angela Rayner, and Health Secretary Wes Streeting. But the honest assessment inside Labour's own corridors is that none of them are ready for an immediate general election campaign. None of them have tested their appeal against a resurgent Reform and a Conservative Party still searching for its own identity. which means that even if the rebellion succeeds, even if Starmer is gone by autumn, Labour does not automatically recover. It enters a contest period. It elects a new leader. It tries to reset its program. And all of this unfolds while the government is expected to function, negotiate trade deals, manage relations with Washington, and deliver public services to people who are already losing patience. The comparison to the Conservative implosion of 2022 is obvious. But there's a crucial difference. When the Conservatives cycled through Johnson, Truss, and Sunak, the country still had an opposition with a clear direction. Labour under Starmer provided a visible alternative. If Labour now implodes, who is the alternative? Reform? The Liberal Democrats? A reconstituted Conservative Party? Those are questions that don't have clean answers. And that's precisely why this moment matters beyond Westminster gossip or party intrigue. A leadership vacuum in one of Europe's major democracies, at a time when the continent is managing an active conflict with Iran, a fragile ceasefire in Ukraine, and a recalibrated U.S. foreign policy under Trump, is not a contained domestic political story. It is a geopolitical variable. And right now, nobody, not Starmer, not his rebels, not the people waiting in the wings to succeed him, has a clear answer for what comes next. This story is not over. It's barely started. The next 72 hours inside Westminster could determine whether Keir Starmer is still Prime Minister by the end of the week, or whether Britain is heading into its fourth leadership transition in under 4 years. What do you think happens? Does Starmer survive this, or is the clock already running out? Drop your answer in the comments and subscribe for every major development as this situation moves, because right now, it's moving fast.